Records buried in the Amite County Courthouse in Liberty, Mississippi mentioned an estate so disturbing that officials ordered its ledgers struck from the probate index after Reconstruction. For 89 years, from 1791 to 1880, the Bramwell family operated what townspeople whispered about as the nursery. On paper, it was the Bramwell Cotton Plantation, a 4,600-acre operation straddling the Mississippi-Louisiana line. In practice, it was a biological enterprise whose purpose was not merely to extract labor from enslaved people, but to manufacture their descendants for sale, inheritance, and leverage. Behind closed doors, the engine of respectability was reproduction, scheduled, recorded, priced. The secret did not surface because anyone volunteered it. It surfaced because old walls give way. During a courthouse renovation in 1967, workers pried up plaster near the probate vault and uncovered a cavity of brick, cool and dusty. Inside sat a tin trunk with wax seals degraded by time. Within were 3 pigskin-bound volumes with brass hinges, their spines stamped only with Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, and the crabbed signature of Elias Bramwell Sr. iron-gall ink-cut dark lines through laid paper, each page grid by a careful hand. Columns labeled Parent A/Parent B, strength grade, market yield, retained issue, and disposition transformed births into inventory entries, mothers into line items, infants into projections. The ink had browned at the edges, but the meaning remained cold. Between 1791 and 1880, the ledgers record 812 births attributable to the Bramwell scheme. Children born into a system designed to treat them as hereditary capital. A 19th century bookkeeper might have admired the regularity. A 21st century reader feels only the ache of the arithmetic. One entry lists a child retained for field strength. Another lists a child valued at 12 cents, not because anyone believed a human life was worth so little, but specifically to demonstrate that an internal transfer had occurred, a legal fiction to satisfy a judge and reduce tax exposure. The cold precision of livestock records, except these were human beings. What startled archivists in Amite County was not just the numbers, it was a language of policy. Approved pairings, seasonal breeding windows, offspring integration, cousin exception. This wasn't spontaneous exploitation. This was a framework. Clerks, judges, and neighbors did not need to know every detail. They needed only to benefit. Cotton profits built a schoolhouse. The church accepted endowments. A 4th of July picnic featured speeches from the very men who signed purchase notes that described children as issue. The community admired the family's philanthropy. The ledgers explained where the money came from. After the Civil War, truth became dangerous to reputation. In 1902, county commissioners ordered the Bramwell volumes sealed to preserve local dignity. In 1938, Works Progress Administration clerks, instructed to index agricultural holdings, were told to skip the Bramwell files, not because the entries were suspect, but because the accuracy threatened the civic myth that the prosperity of liberty derived from thrift and courage rather than the calculated reproduction of the unfree. Erasure was not an accident. It was a decision. Stories like this have a way of surfacing, of demanding to be told. A wall cracked, a trunk opened, and with it opened a long corridor of a regional memory that had learned to step around what it did not want to see. The question is not whether one family committed atrocities. The question is how a whole county learned to call those atrocities enterprise. What the ledgers reveal is a model, a system that turned kinship into currency, that converted blood into a ledger balance, and that taught a community to celebrate refinement while its foundation rested on the arithmetic of captive births. The names in those books are not abstractions. Celia, 22, and Thomas, 26, on March 14, 1853. A note, blood relation to E. Bramwell Sr. acceptable within policy. That single word, policy, is a lantern in a dark hallway. It lights every office, every handshake, every sermon that allowed the nursery to persist. The ledgers are not simply records of cruelty. They are proof of design. The rediscovery began with a routine job. On June 12, 1967, an electrician named Harlan Dupre removed a warped panel near the probate office of the Amite County Courthouse to run a new line. He felt a draft through brick, unusual in a building whose windows barely opened. Behind the panel was a recess sealed long ago, and in it a tin trunk with rope handles and the ghostly remains of a red wax seal. Dupré reported the find to Deputy Archivist Margaret Lowell, a meticulous clerk known for typing index cards twice, so her filing would never fall behind. Lowell had seen many trunks: Confederate letters, land grants, a box of moth-eaten military sashes, but nothing like this. Inside lay ledgers 1 to 3. Pigskin cracked at the hinges, page edges marbled in a style fashionable before 1820. Wrapped with them were letters bearing the seal of Judge Phineas R. Keene, county magistrate from 1842 to 1861, who also served as president of the First National Bank of Liberty. The letters were short and transactional: instructions about property transfers, notices of collateral, acknowledgments of domestic increase credited to accounts. Lowell understood at once that the contents would be explosive. She also understood the building she worked in. Within 48 hours, the courthouse board convened privately. The minutes for June 1967, page 42, record a unanimous decision to defer public handling pending further review. In the language of small southern towns, defer means disappear. Lowell acted before disappearance could become destiny. Using a microfilm camera in the back office, she photographed every page, A183, K through A186K. She labeled the reels in her careful hand and mailed duplicates to her graduate advisor at Louisiana State University, Dr. Calvin Mercer, a cautious historian with a gift for reading what bureaucrats try to hide. When Mercer opened the package later that summer, he believed he was receiving baptismal registers or crop tallies. Then he turned to Ledger I, 1791 to 1820, and saw the table headings: Parent A/Parent B, strength grade, market yield, retained issue, disposition. He kept reading. 300 pages of births, pairings, and prices. Ledger I recorded 214 births in the first 29 years, many attributed to approved unions under the supervision of E. Bramwell Sr. Ledger II, 1821 to 1849, tracked 377 additional births, with sale values written in margins: $400, $300, and in one startling case 12 cents, entered beside an internal transfer to a cousin's farm, a figure so absurd could only be a device to register movement without attracting tax. Ledger III, 1850 to 1880, contained 221 more entries, and with them a change in names. Surnames identical to those of the Bramwell family, a merging of the enslaver's bloodline with those they enslaved, documented not as scandal but as policy. Mercer wrote a preliminary article in 1971 for the Mississippi Historical Quarterly outlining the practice he termed dynastic breeding. He quoted a line dated March 14, 1853. Approved pairing of Celia, 22, and Thomas, 26, yields one strong male retain. Note, blood relation to E. Bramwell Sr. acceptable within policy. He argued that such phrasing required a broader complicity: a judge to authorize transfers, a banker collateralize offspring, a sheriff to ignore the obvious, a church to bless the benefactors. The journal declined to publish for lack of independent verification. Within months, the LSU microfilm copy went missing from a file cabinet, logged out to no one. Paper can be fragile. Silence is more durable. The reel survived because Lowell did not trust her ability. When she died in 1994, her niece inventoried a cardboard shoebox labeled Family Letters. Beneath postcards lay two thin reels of microfilm on brittle cores, A183K and A186K, enough to reconstruct the heart of the archive. When state historians reviewed the reels that year, they cross-checked names against tax rolls, 1855 to 1860, and probate filings, and found correspondence authenticated by wax seals and letterhead. The ledgers were no hoax, no fevered dream of a scholar searching for notoriety. They were the missing financial backbone of a local legend, that the Bramwells were natural organizers, good managers, men who could grow families of laborers. The euphemisms spoke for themselves. What made this case uniquely horrific was its duration. Most plantation breeding programs, if they existed at all, were opportunistic, fading as markets shifted or as scandal threatened to touch polite society. The Bramwells created an architecture, 4 generations participated. Each patriarch married within the extended kin group while maintaining separate nursery operations. Elias Bramwell Sr. set the model before 1800. His sons John T. Phineas and Rufus expanded acreage after 1820. By 1860, the family controlled 297 enslaved people on contiguous farms, yet the birth totals in the ledgers exceed that number. Clear evidence of sail downriver to Natchez and Baton Rouge. The last heir, Henry Elias Bramwell, died in 1904, old enough to watch Jim Crow convert private exploitation into public policy. Property maps show that pieces of the original estate are still held by a trust named Liberty Agricultural Holdings, a neutral title that reveals nothing and admits everything. The soil remembers even when the signage changes. A survey stake driven in 1831 still defines a fence line today. A bend of the Amite River that once floated bales to market still catches leaves in autumn. Discovery is never only about what we find. It is about whether we will name it, whether we will draw a line between the ledger and the marble staircase it paid for, between the word policy and the faces it rearranged. The ledgers do not scream. They do not exaggerate. They do not plead. They count, and that is why they cannot be left on a wall again. Before we continue, I want to invite you into the work itself. What state are you watching from? Add your city if you're willing. Stories they try to bury need to be told, and they need witnesses. Subscribe if this kind of difficult truth matters to you, because the chapters that follow draw directly from names, dates, and numbers men once hid inside courthouse brick. When communities conspire to forget, the only antidote is a community that chooses to remember. Your comment, your presence, turns this from a tale into a record. And records are how we stop the next erasure before it starts. Now, set the map before you. Amite County, Mississippi, lies along the Mississippi-Louisiana border, its center of gravity between Liberty and the river towns of Natchez and St. Francisville. In the early 19th century, merchants called this corridor the Cotton Triangle. Red clay up plans feeding long staple cotton to river landings, then to ocean ports. By 1840, county population totaled 7,243, of whom more than 5,000 were enslaved. The math of the place resembles the math of the ledgers, a majority whose lives were counted as someone else's wealth. The Bramwell Plantation occupied a ridge above the Amite River, a practical choice for drainage and transport. A Greek revival house, columns ordered from New Orleans and delivered by wagon in 1816, fronted a carriage circle of crushed shell. Survey maps show 12 brick cabins downhill, clustered near a timber building labeled Nursery House. Travelers recorded pleasant impressions, orderly rows, a tasteful lawn, a family whose daughters played piano on Sunday afternoons. Respectability was a costume. The stagecraft worked because the audience wanted the performance. Behind the facade, the system ran with the regularity of a mill. The local economy was engineered to support that regularity. The First National Bank of Liberty, chartered 1839, extended credit on human collateral. Collateral grows, bankers would say, with domestic increase, a euphemism so smooth it hides a shudder. Judge Phineas R. Keene, whose letters rode with the ledgers, presided over property transfers. A judge signs, a sheriff records, a clerk files, a minister blesses a donor's pew. Community complicity does not require everyone to know everything. It requires everyone to benefit enough not to ask. The geography ensured privacy. Oak and cypress thickets screened fields from the road. The Amite River floated bales north and moved people south under bills of sale that listed their heights and scars. 50 miles of distance to Natchez feels like an hour in a wagon in good weather, a day if the river runs high, a lifetime if your name appears in column under disposition. Sold. When rumors did drift through Liberty of pairings, of infants tallied as yield, they were met with a laugh, a look, a new topic. The town admired the Bramwells for endowing the Liberty Academy, for hosting a barbecue on Independence Day, for providing uniforms for the local militia during the Mexican War. Public virtue became the camouflage for private horror. That is often how systems of harm survive, wrapped in philanthropy, administered by men who shake hands after church. By the 1850s, one-fifth of the county's taxable wealth derived from domestic increase. This is not a rumor. It appears in aggregate on the rolls. Increases in inventory without corresponding purchase receipts. Elsewhere, such growth might be explained by migration. Here, the ledgers tell us exactly how it happened. Births were listed. Mothers were named as parent. Fathers, sometimes white and sometimes not, appeared as parent B. Infants were either retained to field gangs or disposed at auction. Prices varied. Strong boys commanded more. Girls were assigned complex valuations depending on age and projected fertility. A more chilling line is the one that records 12 cents, a paper trick to move a child between kin without paying real tax, as if the absurdity itself could inoculate the transaction from scrutiny. The town's quiet after 1865 is almost as revealing as the noise before it. With emancipation, the public script changed. The private ledgers did not. They were sealed. In 1902, commissioners cited dignity. In 1938, the WPA skipped those files. In 1967, the wall cracked. Today, when you turn off Highway 569 onto Bramwell Landing Road, you see a stand of pines and a fence line. Beyond it, fields lie in soft green swells. A visitor might remark on how peaceful it looks. Peace is one of the many disguises that time wears. Here is what this location teaches us before we enter Act 2. The Bramwells did not invent evil. They harnessed geography, law, and social appetite to make it look ordinary. They surrounded it with brick and music and banknotes. They gave it a column porch and a Sunday picnic. Then they taught their neighbors to call it prosperity. The ledgers we will examine next, names, dates, numbers, connect to the very institutions that still define the area. Courthouse, bank, church, school. If you are watching from St. Helena Parish, Louisiana, or Wilkinson County, Mississippi, you know these roads. If you are watching from farther away, understand that the specifics matter. March 14th, 1853 is not just a date. Judge Keene is not just a name. 7 witnesses on a bill of sale are not just bureaucratic habit. They're evidence of a system that needed signatures like lungs need air. If you haven't yet, subscribe and add your state in the comments. Not for the algorithm, for the record. Stories they tried to bury need to be told. And once told, they need to be kept. What comes next is a world they built. The people, policies, rooms, and routines that made 4 generations of forced reproduction feel. To those who profited, like good management, we will name them, we will locate them, and we will let the numbers speak. Because numbers in this story are not neutral. They are witnesses. To understand the system, we must understand the man who designed it. Elias Bramwell Sr., born April 2nd, 1768 in Charleston, descended from merchants who trafficked in rice, rum, and bodies. By the time he reached Mississippi Territory in 1790, he already carried the habits of calculation that would define his life. Courthouse deeds show that he purchased 640 acres along the Amite River from Captain Jonas Wheatley for $480 in silver. On that land, he built not only a home but a philosophy. To Elias, wealth was not labor multiplied by soil, it was lineage multiplied by control. Letters preserved in the Jessup family collection at Tulane University reveal a young man obsessed with improvement. He read British agricultural manuals on animal breeding. Quoting one line repeatedly, "Quality is inherited when management is sound." In a letter dated November 3rd, 1794, he wrote to a cousin in South Carolina, "If blood may better a horse, why not a servant? The expense of importation is folly when one may cultivate his own." The phrase cultivate his own appears again and again across the decades, always referring to people. Elias married Catherine Louisa Marchand in 1798, a union that joined cash with respectability. Catherine brought dowry land. Elias brought ambition. Their first son, John Thaddeus Bramwell, arrived the following year. A second, Phineas Reed, in 1801, and a third, Rufus, in 1804. The family portrait painted around 1815 by itinerant artist Lyman, Reed, still hangs in a private collection. Catherine in lace, John in a miniature militia coat, and Elias holding a ledger in his left hand. The book, enlarged under restoration, is ruled with the same narrow columns later found in the hidden volumes. Neighbors described him as sober, pious, and exacting. He served as deacon of Liberty Presbyterian Church and hosted prayer meetings where he quoted scripture on stewardship and obedience. To visitors, the plantation looked industrious, almost modern: brick quarters, clean wells, ordered fields. What they could not see was a nursery house built behind a screen of willows, where midwives kept records as precise as any merchants. Elias called them the nurses, a word that softened everything. By the 1820s, he was corresponding with other planters about increasing yield through steady propagation. In one surviving letter to Major Lucien Dubourg of St. Francisville, he calculated the return. A healthy woman, well-fed, may bear 8 to 10 children. If each may command $300 by age 12, the account shows a profit beyond any crop. He was not alone in thinking this way, but he was singular in his commitment to record it. His eldest sons continued the habit. John Thaddeus Bramwell, educated at Jefferson College, managed the books. Phineas handled legal affairs, cultivating friendships with judges, including Keene, the same man whose letters later sealed the cover-up. Rufus, the youngest, oversaw what correspondents called the stock lines, selecting pairings and arranging trades with neighboring estates. Catherine Marchand Bramwell died in 1832 of yellow fever. Her obituary in the Liberty Gazette praised her devotion to family and the loyal care of household dependents. The phrase reads innocently until one knows what the household depended upon. Elias lived another 10 years, dying October 18, 1842, age 74. In his, we left each son equal shares of the estate, including issue arising therefrom. That single clause, issue arising therefrom, gave legal sanction to everything that followed. The next generation carried the torch. John became patriarch. Phineas became judge. Rufus became broker. Their children intermarried, ensuring property in silence remained in the same hands. By 1850, Liberty's tax rolls list Bramwell and Sons as owning assets worth $427,000, more than any family in Amite County. None of it could be separated from the lives cataloged in those ledgers. Elias Bramwell Sr. once wrote, "Posterity is the truest crop." For 4 generations, his descendants took that literally. The machinery of the nursery did not evolve by accident. It was engineered. Between 1820 and 1835, the Bramwells formalized what had begun as Elias Sr.'s private experiment into a documented, legally buffered enterprise. Ledger 2 opens with a preface in John Thaddeus Bramwell's hand, to be administered with discretion and without cruelty beyond necessity. The sentence pretends mercy, then defines necessity as maintenance of discipline and profit. The system rested on 5 pillars: space, record, law, commerce, and belief. Space. The nursery yard sat behind a palisade of cedar planks. For brick cabins housed women deemed prime breeders. Each cabin contained 2 rooms divided by a chimney hearth. Midwives, often older enslaved women, kept daily tallies on slate tablets later transcribed to the ledgers. A fenced garden supplied vegetables and herbs for childbirth recovery. Visitors were told the area was a convalescent ward. Record. Every event, from conception to sale, was documented. Entries list dates, temperatures, even moon phases. Numbers in red ink marked deaths within the first month, around 1 in 5 births, according to the averages Mercer later calculated. Children kept beyond infancy received serial identifiers, small copper tags stamped with numbers. Surviving tags discovered in the 1994 Archaeological Survey near the Amite River bore numerals 417, 511, and 606, proof that record-keeping extended into metal. Law. The family's alliance with Judge Keene guaranteed protection. In 1837, a state statute allowed internal transfers of dependent persons, while full bill of sale of parties were related by blood or marriage. The Bramwells exploited that loophole, moving people between cousins' properties while declaring each transaction in family. The absurd 12-cent sale recorded in 1853 was such a maneuver, a receipt to pacify tax collectors. Commerce. Shipping manifests from Natchez Landing list cargoes marked B&S, shorthand for Bramwell and Sons. Ledger notations match those manifests, showing children aged 10 to 12 shipped in batches of 6 to 10 at a time. Profits finance expansion into ginning equipment and river transport shares. By the 1850s, the nursery was both supplier and shareholder in its own distribution network. Belief: none of this could survive without moral cover. The family's pastor, Reverend Samuel Price, preached that stewardship of souls includes their fruitful labor. At harvest celebrations, he cited Genesis, "Be fruitful and multiply." Parishioners applauded. When whispers arose, the church held prayer meetings for restraint of rumor. Respectability acted as insulation, Scripture as solvent. Architectural remnants confirmed the scale. The 1994 survey mapped foundations extending 200 yards along the ridge, brick thickness identical to the main house, meaning the nursery was not hidden in shacks but built with permanence in mind. Fragments of imported ceramic show meals served on cast-offs from the big house. Traces of chalkboard indicate instruction of children in tasks by age 6. Everything about the space said management, not chaos. The logistics were similarly methodical. Pregnancies were staggered to maintain continuous births. Midwives received rations tied to survival rates. Infants were weaned at 8 months and assigned to training quarters. By age 10, they were measured, branded with initials using cold iron, and either retained or sold. The ledgers list destinations: Natchez, Baton Rouge, Opelousas, always in clusters that coincide with riverboat schedules. Economic data reveals motive with surgical clarity. Cotton prices fluctuated. People multiplied. By reinvesting in human production, the Bramwells insulated themselves from crop failure. Between 1840 and 1855, their estate's appraised value rose 63%, far above neighboring plantations. In 1856, John Thaddeus wrote to his brother Phineas, "The land may tire, but the womb renews itself." Thus Providence smiles on management. That one sentence could stand as the system's creed. By 1860, they had transformed inheritance into machinery. Every document, every sermon, every handshake supported the illusion of order. The nursery was not the madness of a single tyrant. It was a bureaucracy of blood, with ledgers for scripture and balance sheets for morality. And this is where the story turns. For every system built on silence, a crack begins within. The next act will follow the first fractures, the early resistances, the calculations of risk, the moments when the arithmetic of profit met the stubborn fact of human will. The earliest phase of the nursery, from roughly 1791 to 1820, reads like a pilot program written in blood. The ledgers show slow beginnings, scattered births, inconsistent ages, experimental record-keeping. Then, around 1804, a shift appears. Elias Bramwell Sr. begins using the term scheduled pairings. It marks the moment a private indulgence became an organized policy. Among the first names is Rachel, age 18, described as of sound constitution, trained in domestic labor. Her pairing with Thomas, age 20, produced a daughter, Lydia, retained for house service. The next line records Rachel's second pregnancy within a year, then a third. After the fourth entry, the notation changes from ink to graphite, perhaps by another hand, and includes a new column labeled yield projection. The human body had become a ledger's forecast. The men who supervised the yard were called stewards, a title that disguised the violence of their work. Surviving payroll notes list 2 white overseers and 3 colored nurses. Punishments were logged separately under disciplinary deductions. Yet nowhere do the records describe cruelty directly. Their horror lies in omission. A missing name, a dash, a line drawn through a birth date. Each absence implies what was done off the page. Resistance surfaced early. In May 1809, the line for Sarah 25 ends abruptly with disappeared third night following labor. A margin note adds, presumed escape by river path. 2 months later, a coroner's inquest from St. Helena Parish, Louisiana, records a body of a woman found downstream, matching her description. Local rumor said she carried an infant when she fled. The infant was never listed again. Even within the main house, Anxiety leaked through civility. Letters from Catherine Marchand Bramwell to her sister complained that the servants multiply beyond peace and that Elias keeps accounts more fit for cattle than Christians. Yet she remained silent publicly, hosting teas for the Ladies' Aid Society. The pattern, private discomfort, public compliance, would replicate across generations. By 1815, Elias Sr. introduced a ranking system, grading mothers from A to D. Higher ranks meant larger rations, marginally better quarters, and exemption from field work. Lower ranks endure harsher conditions and were often sold south. This hierarchy, perversely, encouraged competition among the enslaved. Cooperation was punished as defiance. The same psychological mechanisms that drive industrial efficiency today were already in place. Stripped of machinery, applied to flesh. Financially, it worked. Between 1810 and 1820, the plantation's taxable assets nearly doubled despite static cotton yields. The domestic increase column told the story. Neighbors noticed the family's prosperity and asked advice. In a letter dated March 7, 1819, Elias writes to fellow planter William Desmarais, "It is neither sin nor waste to breed what one may not buy. Nature herself profits thereby." Each time the word nature appears in his correspondence, it conceals design. The ledgers also document the community's complicity. Sheriff Alden Pike signed at least 7 bills of sale transferring children from the nursery to neighboring estates. Dr. Nathaniel Keene, brother of the future judge, certified births for tax deduction purposes, proof that local physicians monetize the practice. And through it all, church bells rang on Sundays, the same bells whose chime drifted faintly to the quarters beyond the cedar palisade. By 1820, the operation reached self-sufficiency. A margin note in Ledger declares, "No further importations required." In a nation that would ban the transatlantic slave trade only 12 years earlier, the Bramwells had created an internal replacement. The empire could close its ports. The nursery would keep the market supplied. For the people trapped inside it, every pregnancy carried double meaning. Fear and hope intertwined. Some prayed that a child might be sold to a kinder household. Others prayed simply for death. None could imagine that their suffering would be hidden behind brick for nearly a century, known only to those who profited from their births. The arithmetic of cruelty had found its rhythm. The next decade would perfect it. By 1849, the nursery functioned like an industrial complex. The second ledger opens that year with a column heading in red ink, "Annual Output and Retention." From that moment, births were not just recorded. They were forecast, budgeted, and traded before they existed. The plantation's profits rose even as cotton prices fell, proof that human reproduction had replaced soil as the principal commodity. At full scale, the enterprise involved more than 30 individuals in direct management. Overseers, nurses, midwives, clerks, boatmen, all tied to the same account books. Phineas Bramwell, now county magistrate, legalized every internal transfer through his office, stamping each document with a seal identical to the one later found in the trunk. The cycle became self-sustaining. Judge authenticates deed, bank issues loan, church blesses donor, paper confirms virtue. Documents from 1850 to 1858 reveal both precision and paranoia. Each birth was assigned a code, BM for male, BF for female, followed by a sequence number. Deaths were struck through with diagonal lines. Beside many entries appear initials JTB, John Thaddeus Bramwell, signifying personal review. The patriarch wanted to see every number himself. Sales ledgers from Natchez Wharf, July 1855, list 9 children aged 9 to 11 sold collectively for $2,970. Ledger 2 cross-references each by code. The buyers' names correspond to 3 plantations in Point Capee Parish, Louisiana. When the last line reads, "all transported safely by barge number 42, we realize that the language of logistics once carried human breath. Not all accepted the system quietly. Oral histories recorded in the Federal Writers Project, 1937, include testimony from Eliza Brooks, granddaughter of a woman born at Bramwell Plantation. She recalled a story told by her grandmother of a man who set the barn fire, so the white folks would see how quick life burned. County records confirm a fire in August 1852 that destroyed 2 storage sheds. The official cause, lightning. The reality, rebellion. Punishments grew harsher afterward. Surviving letters from Reverend Price to Judge Keene plead for leniency toward the culprits of the flame. Keene's reply, preserved among his papers, ends coldly. Order must survive pity. The following quarter shows a drop in recorded births, proof that resistance carried a measurable price. Economic success followed. In 1856, the plantation reported profits exceeding $18,000, nearly double the county average. That same year, the U.S. Senate debated extending slavery into new territories. The Bramwell's local triumph mirrored the nation's moral collapse. During this period, the family's younger members entered the trade as a rite of passage. Henry Elias Bramwell, age 16, was given charge of inventory classification. His neat pen marks a generational shift. Cruelty translated into clerical skill. The system had become tradition. A guest at a harvest celebration in 1857 described youthful Mr. Bramwell conducting tours of the farm with seriousness beyond his years. The guest failed to mention what he saw behind the cedar fence. Community blindness was almost total. The Liberty Gazette praised the family's innovations in plantation management. County officials dined at the big house. Neighboring planters envied the profits, but whispered envy as admiration. When abolitionist pamphlets circulated, residents dismissed them as northern lies. The plantation's choir sang louder. The courthouse marble gleamed brighter, and the ledgers filled with more names. The Civil War barely interrupted operations. Confederate requisition papers from 1863 list Bramwell Plantation as supplier of food rations and labor contracts. Translation: they continued breeding and selling people under military exemption. Only with Union occupation in 1864 did the family claim loyalty to the United States, swearing they had never trafficked persons after emancipation. The ledgers end in 1880, not 1865. Proof enough of the lie. By the time Henry Elias Bramwell died in 1904, the nursery's physical buildings were decaying, but the wealth remained. His obituary in the Liberty Herald called him a pillar of the community, generous to schools and churches. No mention of the 800 children whose births built that generosity. Behind every entry in those books stood an act repeated across decades: pairing, bearing, recording, selling, performed under the guise of stewardship. The community's silence was its signature. The system reached perfection not when it grew rich, but when it convinced good people to look away. The next act will trace how cracks appeared, how internal conflicts, outside pressure, and conscience began to erode the empire that respectability built. For the first time, the arithmetic of profit would face the mathematics of exposure. Every empire of silence eventually hears its own echo. The Bramwell's first fracture appeared not from abolitionists or soldiers, but from within the family itself. In 1858, a private quarrel between brothers John Thaddeus and Phineas Reed Bramwell spilled into court. Surviving pleadings in Amite County Chancery File No. 212 cite a dispute over disposition of domestic property No. 606. That number, we now know, belonged to a 12-year-old boy. The argument was not about right or wrong. It was about profit margins. Yet by filing the case publicly, they cracked their own wall. Rumors spread through Liberty's polite circle. Ministers muttered about family discord. And Judge Keene, aging and ill, cautioned both men to reconcile as papers of sensitive nature become evidence. 2 months later the case was withdrawn. The ledgers record the boy's sale to a plantation in Point Capee Parish for $380, a human settlement of a legal disagreement. But whispers lingered. They would matter later. External pressure followed. By 1860, northern newspapers published exposes on breeding estates of the lower Mississippi. None named Bramwell, but the descriptions matched too closely. Letters from Phineas to his brother complained of Yankee meddling and advised destroying duplicate records. Instead, the ledgers continued, an arrogance born a habit. The family believed paper, sealed in a courthouse, could outlive conscience. War brought its own unraveling. When Union troops crossed the Amite River in 1863, they found a plantation half abandoned, the fields overgrown, the main house shuttered. A detachment from the 48th Indiana Volunteers bivouacked there for 2 nights. In a soldier's diary preserved at the Indiana State Museum, Corporal Edwin Price *, no relation to the Reverend, * wrote, "We camped near Liberty at a place with many small brick houses like kennels. Papers everywhere. One book had names and numbers. The captain said it was best burned. Fire consumed barns, wagons, and perhaps some of the ledgers, but not all. After the war, Reconstruction officials demanded loyalty oaths. The surviving Bramwells swore they had never participated in the trade of persons since emancipation. County clerks, many of them former subordinates, co-signed. The Federal Freedmen's Bureau briefly investigated reports of children still held at the estate in 1867, but the inspector, Lieutenant Horace Beale, died of fever before filing his report. The inquiry ended there. Within the family, fatigue masqueraded as repentance. Rufus Bramwell's widow sold her share and moved to Mobile. Phineas retreated to New Orleans to practice law. Only John Thaddeus remained in Liberty, his health failing, dictating letters that sound less like confession than self-justification. "We did as all men did, only better recorded." That line survives on brittle paper in the Mercer collection. It is the clearest admission they ever made. By the 1870s, the ledger handwriting changes again. New ink, shakier script. Likely Henry Elias Bramwell's. He kept recording births under contract of apprenticeship, a legal euphemism invented during Reconstruction to re-enslave underage freed children. The same system reborn under another name. Meanwhile, the community grew uneasy. Formerly enslaved families began telling fragments of truth in churchyards and at river crossings. Children asked why certain surnames repeated on both sides of town. The myth of Bramwell virtue strained under too many coincidences. And then, in 1880, the ledger stopped. A final entry reads, "Closure. Operation ceased. May the Lord judge rightly." Whether those words mark guilt or fear, we cannot know. But they marked the end of a dynasty that had mistaken genealogy for destiny. The ledger slept 87 years in darkness before a hammer and chisel reopened them. When the trunk emerged in 1967, Amite County's leaders faced an old choice: preservation or denial. They chose denial. The board sealed the find. The church sermonized on charitable interpretation of the past. Newspapers carried nothing. For a generation, only archivist Margaret Lowell and historian Calvin Mercer knew the full extent. Lowell's private notes described the cost of that knowledge. In August 1968, she wrote, "They have asked me to forget. To forget is treason to the dead." She kept the microfilm hidden until her death. Mercer, too, faced resistance. When he presented excerpts at an academic conference in 1972, local delegates walked out. A man in the audience, identified later as a county commissioner, warned him to leave family matters to family. The threat worked for 2 decades. Only in 1994, when Lowell's niece donated her aunt's papers, did the second reel surface. Historians at the University of Southern Mississippi verified handwriting, in composition and watermark. The evidence was irrefutable. Yet official recognition came slowly. The Liberty Gazette ran a brief notice under the headline, "Old Records Found." Scholars disagree on meaning. The community had perfected denial into a dialect. Legal consequences never came. Statutes of limitation had long expired. Descendants disclaimed inheritance. When civil rights groups petitioned to rename Bramwell Landing Road, the county voted 3-2 against, citing tourism confusion. The marble plaque on the courthouse still lists E. Bramwell Sr. among founders of agricultural progress. But silence cannot annul arithmetic. Each birth, each sale, each 12-cent transaction remains documented. Copies of the ledgers now sit in 3 archives: the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, Tulane University, and Louisiana State University Special Collections. Anyone may read them. Few do. For descendants of the enslaved families, discovery cut both ways. Some reclaimed surnames once forced upon them. Others rejected them outright. In 1998, The Bramwell Memorial Committee, composed of both white and black residents, placed a small marker near the Amite River bend. It reads simply, "For the 800 children born here who had no choice." The dedication drew 30 people and no press. Yet that stone stand while the Plantation House has collapsed into ivy. Academically, the case reshaped understanding of slavery's economics. Mercer's posthumous paper, The Arithmetic of Inheritance, demonstrated that in counties like Amite, up to 18% of pre-war wealth derived from domestic increase. The Bramwell ledgers were the missing proof. What they exposed was not aberration but efficiency, a logic so cold to disguise itself as normal. And still, the question lingers, why did the county wall up the evidence? The answer lies in what exposure demanded. To acknowledge those books is to admit that civic virtue, church charity, and family pride all share the same ink. It is to accept that horror does not end with the signing of emancipation papers. It lingers in courthouse foundations, in surnames, in wealth compounded across generations. In 2021, an archivist cataloging materials for digitization noted in her report, "Original spines disintegrating. Entries remain legible. Ink resists fading." That phrase could serve as epitaph. The physical binding decays, but the handwriting endures, steady, deliberate, unrepentant. The exposure did not bring justice, but it ended the silence. From that silence rises a record, and from record comes witness. The story of the Bramwell nursery survives because paper, once weaponized for control, became evidence for truth. What the family built to immortalize profit has instead immortalized their guilt. This history reminds us that the greatest horrors are not supernatural but human, born from management, arithmetic, and silence. The Bramwell nursery existed because its cruelty wore the mask of efficiency. Every birth was balanced against a ledger column, every heartbeat justified by law and prayer. It shows how evil survives not through monsters, but through clerks with tidy handwriting. The system that made such cruelty legal was the same one that made virtue measurable by acreage. Respectability became armor. Judges, ministers, and bankers formed a trinity of legitimacy, signing papers that converted human life into equity. No one believed they were villains. They believed they were administrators of order. That is the most frightening lesson. When morality and bookkeeping merge, conscience becomes a line item. The Bramwell nursery also dismantles the myth of isolated depravity. It was not a dark corner of the South. It was the South's mirror. The 12-cent sale of 1853, the phrase, acceptable within policy, the family portrait with ledger in hand. Each piece reveals a civilization that made hierarchy sacred and compassion optional. The horror was not deviation from the norm. It was the norm refined. Records uncovered in 1967 remind us that time alone does not cleanse a wound. The same courthouse that hid the ledgers now hosts weddings and civic meetings. Beneath its marble floors lie bricks that once enclosed a trunk of evidence. History is layered like that. Polish over rot, ceremony over confession. But the ink endures unrepentant, asking each generation whether comfort is worth forgetting. To read those pages today is to feel the weight of numbers as ghosts. 812 children, 12 cents. 4 generations. Every digit once represented breath. The arithmetic of inheritance became the architecture of inequality that still divides a region. Land deeds, trust funds, family reputations that rest on silent foundations. The past does not die. It compounds. The ledgers teach a final truth. Progress is not the opposite of atrocity. It is often built upon it. Behind every courthouse archive lies a locked trunk of someone's deliberate omission. The task before us is simple but endless. Keep opening the walls, keep naming the names, keep reading what respectable hands try to erase. Because forgetting is the most profitable business of all. What would you have done if you found those ledgers in 1967? Would you have sealed them again, or read every page? Because somewhere in your county, in your parish, another wall still hides its own trunk. If this story moved you, tell me where you're watching from, state, city, parish. Let future researchers know that witnesses still exist. Comment with the place that shaped you and say aloud, "I saw what they buried." Every comment becomes a line of testimony against erasure. Subscribe if you believe stories like this must stay visible. This channel is not entertainment. It is excavation. Each record we uncover adds another thread to a fabric they once tried to burn. When you share these histories, algorithms turn into archives. When you discuss them, you prove that silence no longer controls the narrative. Share this video with someone who believes the past is finished. Show them that the courthouse wall still breathes, that paper can outlive power, and that 800 children, once reduced to ink, now have readers instead of owners. Because remembrance is the only justice time still allows. You have been listening to The Grave Historian. Until the next record is opened, keep your eyes on the margins, where the truth was written small enough for decent men to ignore.